Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fanfic reread project. In this episode, we are continuing our reread of Batman Begins with a Bruce chapter. So, I want to note that while I have re listened to some of these episodes recently, it's actually been almost a month since the last time I've recorded one of these. Not that you'll know that because this is all going up later, but so if I said like, oh, pin this in any of the previous episodes and a point comes up and I kind of miss it here, that's why. So as you remember, last episode we left off on a Gordon chapter which ended with him and his partner, Officer No First Name Roberts, figuring out that Jonathan Crane was Scarecrow. So let's get into it. Bruce stepped out from the bookcase, already in his dress and slipping into his heels. Alfred was waiting for him. "Oh, when you told me your grand plan for saving Gotham," he started, "the only thing that stopped me from calling the men in white coats was that you said it wasn't about thrill-seeking." "It's not," he said back. "Zip me up, will you?" He being Bruce, this time. "Well, then what do you call that?" He pointed to the small television sitting on the shelf. The screen showed police footage of the tumbler barreling down the highway under the helicopter's spotlights. He bent down in front of a small mirror on the shelf and started applying his makeup. "Damn good television," he said with a smirk. "It's a miracle no one was injured. I didn't exactly have time to observe the highway code. You're getting lost in this creature of yours." Bruce stopped. He felt his stomach. Bruce stopped. He felt his stomach clench suddenly. "I'm using this creature to help people like my father did. For Thomas Wayne, helping others was never about proving anything to anyone, even himself. It was Rachel, Alfred. She was dying." Alfred's expression softened. "She's downstairs. I need you to take her home." He sighed. "We both care about Rachel, sir, but what you're doing has to be beyond that. It cannot be personal." Bruce looked towards the door. "Is Mr. Fox still here?" Alfred nodded. "We need to send these people away," he said as he started out of the room. "Sir, those are Bruce Wayne's guests out there. You have a name to maintain." Bruce narrowed his eyes when he looked back. "I don't care about my name." Alfred's lips tightened. "It's not just your name, it's your parents', and it's all that's left of them. Don't destroy it." He turned and exited through the bookcase himself. Bruce marched toward the front of the house. I don't really have anything to say about the actual content of this scene. It's fine. It's not really that different from what happens in the movie, to be honest. But I do have one comment about something else. And this actually relates to something that came up in a previous episode. I don't remember which one exactly. But it's whatever episode has the chapter where Rachel goes home on a train and almost gets jumped by Falcone's thugs. So as I mentioned there, Bruce is non-binary in this, and as we see throughout this, Bruce presents in a, I guess, feminine way. But this chapter is actually one of the few times, at least in this part, where that is kept up with. So the thing that I wanted to note, though, is the fact that this is actually a change that came along after I had initially written after I had initially written all of these. So all three stories were written before it's not a gender swap, but before I changed Bruce's gender. Originally, Bruce was a cisgender dude. So when I go forward in this and calling back to that episode where we read that chapter, the reason why sometimes things happen that seem like the story is trying to make commentary about something, but it falls flat because Bruce isn't a guy, and so the dynamic is going to be different. That's why. And it really does surprise me that when I was doing all of these edits, it's especially surprising in The Dark Knight Rises, but we'll talk about that when we get to it. But it is surprising that in all of these edits, I would do that stuff and then not catch the fact that the dynamics would be changed. Like I said, I think we've passed the one moment where it's really a thing in this story, but when we get to The Dark Knight Rises, specifically to Selina's chapters, we will talk more about this because it's very, very glaring there and it's kind of ridiculous. And it's just weird looking back that I didn't stop and think like, hey, this scene kind of doesn't make sense anymore. But yeah, I'm hoping that that kind of clears up why that scene from that previous chapter is like that. It wasn't just me going into it and just being like doopa doopa doo, of course this makes sense and it's the same way. It was me not editing it correctly and then, you know. So, moving on. Bruce walked in to find the main hall sparkling. Since he'd left, they had put up more balloons, and they had turned on all the chandeliers. Tables had been brought in and filled with food. The floors glittered brilliant white under the bright lights. There he is! The entire crowd took notice of him then. He waded right into the throng of partygoers, shaking hands and receiving hugs. Mrs. Evans greeted him particularly enthusiastically, grabbing his whole face and planting a large kiss on his forehead. Jeez. One thing I do want to say is that it feels like there's a weird disconnect between the description of the people in the room and the description of the physical space itself. So it seems like he comes in and he's like, wow, the hall, and he describes the hall. In and of itself, the description of the hall really kind of falls flat for it to be like, oh, so impressive. And I know we got a little glimpse of it earlier, but I feel like this could have been more like, wow, it really transformed the room, you know? But it's weird that it describes the hall and then it talks about the people. It doesn't mention like, oh, it's filled with people or anything. So it seems like an empty room and then suddenly it's like, there he is, and all the people just appear. I don't know if anyone else had that same like feeling, but that's just the way I felt reading it. So, moving on. Happy birthday, Bruce, someone else said. He turned to find Earl behind him. Mr. Earl, how did the stock offering go? Very well, he said jovially. The price soared. Who was buying? A variety of funds and brokerages. He shrugged. It's all a bit technical. The key thing is, our company's future is secure. Bruce smiled and nodded. He dove back into the crowd, speaking to more people, many of his parents' old friends that he didn't remember, until he found Mr. Fox at a table full of food in the back of the room. Bruce lowered his voice. Thank you for that, item. I'm sure you'll find a use for it. I already have. How long would it take to manufacture it on a large scale? Fox's brow nodded. Weeks. Why? Someone's planning to disperse it using the water supply. The water supply isn't going to help you disperse an inhalant. There was a sudden change in his expression. Unless you have access to a microwave emitter strong enough to vaporize the water in the mains, like the ones Wayne Enterprises have recently misplaced. Bruce tilted his head to the side. Earl just fired me for asking too many questions. I need you to go back and start making more of the antidote. The police are going to need as much as they can get their hands on. My security access has been revoked. That wouldn't stop a man like you, now, would it? Fox smiled. No, it probably wouldn't. The two said their goodbyes, and then Bruce turned to find Tony staring at him expectantly. What did I do? Okay, now let me actually stop here, because I need to make a comment. So, throughout this story, there are multiple plot points that are revealed to have sort of like happened off screen. Some of them are smaller things, like Rachel's boss getting kidnapped, but there are bigger things, like Falcone being poisoned, and then this stolen device here. And the reason why that is because there are only 3 POV characters, discounting the third-person omniscient Batman narrator. So anything that doesn't happen within the bounds of these 3 characters, you don't see. And I'm still back and forth on whether I'm okay with that, because it means that we keep having these different, like, plot devices revealed to us by characters just telling us it instead of us seeing it. And, like, I think what's hard is that I have other stories where there are similar situations. I think the only reason why it bothers me here is because this is based off of a movie. So we know we saw all that stuff, like, in the film, but here you kind of skip over it. And, like, again, there are levels to it. Like, when Rachel is saying, like, oh, my boss got kidnapped, we didn't need to see that. I was totally okay with her just saying that, you know, because it totally makes sense that Rachel would be like, oh, you know, my boss disappeared and we're starting to get a little bit worried. She might just mention that. And so it's not that weird. But the literal, like, theft of this pretty important machine and the fact that it even exists is not brought up until this very moment. And that's a little bit like, Now, if the machine had been brought up previously, and then here it's mentioned that it got stolen, I probably wouldn't care as much. I think maybe that's the issue here. Not so much that it happens off screen, but that this machine, we didn't even know it existed until he mentioned this. Which is funny, because we have 2 chapters where Bruce and Fox are, like, going through the R&D department and looking at shit that didn't get picked up for like wider manufacturing. Why couldn't that have been one of the things? I guess I just didn't think of it at the time because that's not how it was presented in the film. But yeah, so moving on, back to Tony. Bruce turned to find Tony staring at him expectantly. What did I do? You started you started the party early and you didn't invite me, for one. He didn't cover that up as well as he thought he had, he being Bruce. He pulled a glass of champagne from the table and shrugged. It's my birthday. He kissed Tony on the cheek. He was greeted by the scent of gin and sandalwood. He felt himself relax a little. Okay. Oh god, I think I have talked about this, but the pronoun game here is just like ridiculous. Clearly, like, if you have two people with the same pronouns, say the names just slightly more often than you would. It's not that hard. But moving on. Mary Jane came and grabbed the flute for herself. A sparkling midnight blue dress was draped over her sturdy frame. I'm surprised you had a party at all. We used to have to drag you out just to get breakfast. He shrugged again. Birthday. Those two. Where's Peter? He had to work. She rolled her eyes. You know how it is. Have you been working out? Don't change the subject, Tony said, taking him by the arm. You disappear for 7 years. 7 years, mind you, where you didn't call me. And suddenly you show back up buying hotels and... Since when do you drink? Mary Jane laughed. It's his birthday, Tony. Who are you and what have you done with Bruce Wayne? I was finding myself. Really? They both said it at the same time. Mary Jane rolled her eyes. He suddenly felt Mrs. Evans behind him. Oh, Bruce, honey, there's someone you simply must meet. Not just now, Mrs. Evans, but she wasn't having any of it. She already had his arm. He whispered an apology to the pair. I'm staying over tonight, Tony said. We're going to talk about this later. Mary Jane just shook her head amusedly. All right, so I'm going to pause right there and note. Because this is a really good example of the stuff that I was talking about with Rachel before, and the fact that I feel like Bruce's relationship with Rachel is not what he thinks it is. Did anyone else notice how quickly Tony just completely deconstructs this entire, like, facade? Bruce isn't even really putting on right now. And Tony immediately comes in and is like, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, what the fuck is going on? And Mary Jane does it too. That says a lot to me. It's interesting that literally all Bruce does is walk up, look a little tired, pick up a glass of champagne, and they're just like, nope, this is completely wrong, what the fuck? But when Rachel sees Bruce at a fancy restaurant having just climbed out of the pool, she completely is just like, he's been swimming. That's interesting. That's very interesting. And it's interesting because Bruce has known Rachel a lot longer than he's known Tony. Bruce met Tony, I think like 9 or 10 years ago, something like that. Same with Mary Jane and Peter. But he's known Rachel for almost his entire life. And she's not able to see completely through this facade. Clearly, it's not good enough. Because these characters literally just walk in and then just like, why the hell are you even having a party? Like, that alone tipped them off. But she sees him swimming, quote unquote, and it just like falls for it. Like I said, I don't think that relationship is as like strong maybe as he believes it is. I feel like Tony and Mary Jane have a scene, like a somewhat prominent scene in this specifically to contrast their reaction to meeting him with Rachel's. Because when you look at it in tandem with all of the scenes, like all of the stuff that Rachel has been saying about like, oh, Bruce has been back, but he hasn't been here. Those little tidbits in, I don't remember, we didn't number the chapters, but that Bruce chapter before he goes out to dinner with Brianna, where there's that weird little moment where it sounds like he has spoken to Mary Jane or Tony or Peter, but hasn't spoken to Rachel yet. When you look at all of that in tandem with like this scene and the scene from the flashback of him and Tony, things really don't add up. And this is really important to remember when we go into The Dark Knight and The Dark Knight Rises. But I do feel like I put this in specifically for contrast. Now we can keep going. Mrs. Evans led him over to an older man in a dark green suit. Now, am I pronouncing this right? Mr. Al Ghul? Bruce looked at this man, absolutely confused. Why was I so obsessed with the word absolutely back in the day? Preoccupied, I shouldn't use obsessed, but still, like, why? He did resemble Roz to a point, but he knew full well that this was not the same man who led the League of Shadows. He asked Mrs. Evans for a moment and turned back to the man. "You're not Ra's al Ghul. I watched him die." "But is Ra's al Ghul immortal?" An old familiar voice began behind him. "Are his methods supernatural? Or cheap parlor tricks to conceal your real identity?" Bruce said, turning. Ducard, or rather, the true Ra's al Ghul, stood before him, a bright blue poppy in his buttonhole that seemed the same color as his eyes. So I wanted to note here that I think this is the scene where the Ra's al Ghul race lift really becomes important. Not that that's brought up here at all. But the fact that we are told very early on that Ra's al Ghul is a person of color, or not Ra's al Ghul, Ducard is a person of color, and then Ra's al Ghul, I think, is implied to also be colored. Like, that becomes important, like I said, here, because, yes, I understand, I think, in the movies, that Ra's al Ghul is just a title. However, that does not change the fact that having a reveal where you have an Asian man pretending to be another Asian man turn into a reveal that said Asian man is actually a white man, that's not okay. Now here, is it a bit weird? Because as far as I can remember, I don't think Ra's al Ghul is the same race as fake Ra's al Ghul. I'm not entirely sure though, because the story is kind of vague on that. So it blurs the lines. I don't know if that makes it okay, but the fact that it's not like a white man stepping out and being like, "Oh, it turns out that I am the real person that this was, not these brown people." Instead, it's just another brown person. He's just like, "Hey, the dynamic definitely changes there." And I think it was actually really smart to make that change. Presumably in this, Ra's al Ghul is the same ethnicity and or race that Ra's al Ghul is in the comics. Not entirely sure. But I would assume, because the book doesn't actually say anything different. But moving on. He dropped the accent Bruce had grown to know. He still couldn't place the new one, but it sounded more Eastern. Maybe. "Surely a man who spends his nights scrambling over the rooftops of Gotham wouldn't begrudge me dual identities." "I save you from the fire," Bruce said in disbelief. He smiled. "I warned you about compassion, Bruce." So this is actually another good example of that. I think I purposefully made it so that it was hard to tell where Ducard was from. Both before and after the reveal, because the fact that his accent is hard to place, no matter which accent he's using, is pretty notable. He could feel that tightening in his stomach again. "Your quarrel is with me," he said through gritted teeth. "Let these people go. You're welcome to explain the situation to them." Your quarrel is with me. This story takes place in 2007. Who talks like that? Those lines like that are lines that I should have been like, okay, let's change this. But it is kind of weird how spotty my changes are, where I'm just like, oh, Rachel's speech doesn't make sense, which, fair enough, I guess. And then changing that. But then lines like, "Your quarrel is with me." Lines that sound like, I think people literally have said in, like, Game of Thrones. And I don't change them at all. Sure. Bruce bit his lip, thinking. Then he turned. Everyone, I just wanted to thank you all." He raised his glass. "For drinking my booze." Some people laughed. No, really. The thing about being a Wayne is that you're never short of a few freeloaders to fill up your mansion. So here's to you people. Mr. Fredericks reached for his glass. "I think that's quite enough." But Bruce snatched his hand away and downed the whole thing in one gulp. "I'm not finished. To all you false friends and pathetic suck-ups who smile through your teeth at me, you've had your fill. Now leave me in peace. Go. Please, go. The apple has fallen very far from the tree, Mr. Wayne." He watched Fredericks go, along with all the rest of them, some insulted, some saddened, and others just downright confused. A few scattered people hung around the room, but he recognized them all from the monastery. Bruce took a deep breath to calm his churning stomach. So, quick question. Why did Tony leave? That always sticks with me. It doesn't really make sense. I understand, like, plot-wise why Tony left, but character-wise, it doesn't make sense that him or Mary Jane would have left after that nonsense. They would have been like, what the fuck is wrong with you, I have noticed that outside of this story, there is, like, a criminal lack of Tony, to the point of not making sense. But as I said, we will talk about this more, especially when we get to The Dark Knight Rises, but I think it might come up in The Dark Knight, too. So moving on. Roz appeared at his side. Amusing. Crane's working for you, isn't he? We prefer not to associate ourselves with the likes of psychopaths. Bruce rolled his eyes. That's rich. However, Roz continued, obviously annoyed, his toxin is derived from the organic compound in our poppies. He was able to weaponize it. And he's going to unleash it on the entire city, Bruce finished. Roz shrugged. Maybe. And Gotham will tear itself apart in fear. You're not going to try to stop him? This city is beyond saving, Bruce. We've had this discussion before, he said, moving to the corridor. Bruce followed behind him, fuming. This place is nothing but a breeding ground for crime and despair. He snapped his fingers, and men moved to the drapes, lining the windows, setting them on fire. When a forest grows too wild, a purging fire is inevitable and natural. I regret not being the man to light the spark, but I am more than happy to watch it burn. Bruce spun around and grabbed a ninja by the throat before they could attack him. He whipped around again to grab Rod's sword before it could pierce his throat. Oh, does that not hurt? Maybe you taught me too well, or perhaps you'll never learn to mind your surroundings as well as your opponent. He smashed his cane against the column, and a burning beam crashed down on him. You burned down my home and left me for dead. Consider us even. All right. Pause. Number one, it used to take me the fuck out that Ra's al Ghul basically came all the way to Gotham City to burn down Bruce's house in revenge and then just leave. Because, and this is a really important reveal that we just had, Crane isn't working for Ra's al Ghul in this version. What? I think I talked about this reveal, maybe not last episode, but no, maybe it was last episode. But I talked about there was more twists with Jonathan Crane that we were gonna see. Honestly, I am so back and forth on how I feel about the Crane plot, but I feel like of all of the plots where the primary action of it seems to happen off screen until it doesn't, his is done the best. And I think actually like that mystery is pretty well done. Because again, given the fact that this has like a really tight POV, save the stuff with Batman, the way that the information about him is dispersed through the plot, I think actually makes a lot of sense. Like, sure, we don't see Falcone being drugged by him, but we don't need to. Because the information is conveyed elsewhere. Like, by the time you get, like, even halfway through Rachel's chapter, you know what happened, you know? The story never comes right out and has Jonathan Crane say, oh, see, haha, I've drugged Falcone. Like, after he attacks Rachel, you're like, oh, okay, you know? Or even, like, if you're a person who knows the story, the moment that Rachel says, why does he keep saying Scarecrow, you're like, oh, yeah, that. I think it's pretty okay for a mystery and stuff, and especially with one that is supposed to work without a lot of dramatic irony. I think it's pretty well done. So moving on. Bruce came to after feeling a sharp slap to his face. In the wavering heat, he saw Alfred and a raging inferno behind him. He tried to push at the beam on his chest, but it wouldn't move. Sir, what is the point of all those push-ups if you can't lift a bloody log? Bruce glared at him, then pushed the beam off with such force that Alfred jumped back in shock. He staggered to his feet, and the two of them headed towards the study. Flames covered the entire room when they entered. Bruce jabbed at the keys on the piano, and the bookcase creaked forward, charred volumes falling from the shelves. They dove onto the elevator just as the ceiling collapsed behind them. The fire exploded through the passage as they hurtled to the ground. What did I do, Alfred? He whispered. Everything my family built is gone. He could feel the tears stinging at his eyes. Alfred grabbed Bruce's bloodied hand. There was a gash right down the middle of his palm. It burned from the sweat on Alfred's own hands. The Wayne legacy is more than bricks and mortar, sir. I thought I could save Gotham, but I failed. And why do we fall, sir? He said, ripping at the sleeve of Bruce's shirt and wrapping it around the wound, so that we might learn to pick ourselves up. Still haven't given up on me? Never. And that is the end of that chapter. Okay, right away, before we get into, like, whole chapter things, ripping at the sleeve of Bruce's shirt. What shirt? I think what bothers me about this one is that this was an easy fix. Just have Alfred rip at his own shirt. Because Bruce, it's very clearly said at the beginning of the chapter that Bruce is wearing a dress. Like, he does not have any shirt on. Clearly it's left over from the old version where he was wearing a shirt. Just change it to Alfred. But yeah, overall, this chapter, I think the content of this chapter is much stronger than the prose carrying it, which is, I always feel weird saying that, because it's like, how can the content of the chapter be better than the vehicle used to deliver it. But there are multiple times where I feel that way, not just in this story, but in others. Like reading through this, it has all of the same like quirks and issues that the rest of the story has, and those annoy me. But the action itself and like what's actually happening in the chapter is pretty engaging. I love the scene with Tony and Mary Jane. Like, I love that. And I love that we actually get to see him interact with those characters in the modern day and not just in flashbacks, especially because Mary Jane wasn't even in the flashback. I'm kind of sad that Peter never interacts with Bruce on screen, but hey. I think like the reveal that Jonathan Crane isn't working for Ra's al Ghul, I think that's actually pretty well done. I like the way that I wrote, not around it, but I like the way that I kind of like refit the lines from the actual movie in that same scene to work with this reveal. I really love Ra's al Ghul's line about, like, I regret that I'm not the one to spark the flame, but I'm more than happy to watch it. But, like, that's a great line. That might be one of the best things I've written in any of my early works. But yeah, like, the content of this chapter is not bad. It's just that I wish the writing was better. Because this could have been, like, super duper engaging. But, hey, it is what it is, right? So, we are halfway through this episode, hopefully, and I have read one chapter. Jesus Christ. Alright, so let's move on to the next chapter where we switch to Rachel's POV. Rachel jolted awake on her bed. It was dark, but she was fully clothed. Even her shoes were still on. That was strange, she thought. She didn't even remember falling asleep. Her entire body was stiff as she sat up, and her eyes hurt something fierce. She was about to let it go, however, when she noticed a syringe and a vial lying on her bedside table. It all came flooding back to her then. The asylum, the poison, the cave. She remembered absolutely all of it. That line was completely unnecessary. The Batman's words echoed in the back of her mind as she moved for her coat. There was a question that nagged at her as she drove. She was sure she had known the identity of the Batman in the cave, but the answer wouldn't come to her then. Her mind was clearer now. She could actually think about it. He did seem so familiar to her. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. Bruce. It was Bruce. But that was impossible, she thought. There was no way that he was the Batman. He couldn't even have been there. His birthday party was that night. Yet she knew the way he had cocked his head to the side when he asked questions. He'd always done that. And the more she thought about it, the more connection she made. Hell, even through that throaty growl he did, she could almost hear his voice. She still doubted herself, though. There was no way. So I always like to point out this line because of the way that, both in this and in The Dark Knight Rises, when characters find out that Bruce is Batman, there's kind of like a refuge in audacity sort of thing going on where both characters immediately talk themselves out of it because they're like, no, that doesn't even make sense, but for different reasons. Refuge in audacity is a trope where I think it's more like a character says something, but the other characters find it so ridiculous that they don't believe them. So the character just like gets away with whatever it is because no one will believe that what they're saying is true because it sounds so ridiculous. I always note that like both Rachel and Selena are both like, no way. But it's interesting to compare and contrast like the reasons why. But of course we won't be able to talk about that fully until we get to The Dark Knight Rises. So let's keep moving on. The bridge to the island wasn't far from where she lived in Midtown. She reached it in a few minutes. The intersection in front of it was flooded with police cars. She was confused. That should have cleared up by now. "What's going on?" she said to one of the officers. "There's been a breakout, ma'am. We're preparing to raise the bridge," he told her. She got out of her car then. "I need to get onto the island." "I'm sorry, but you won't have time to get back over." She put up a hand to stop him. "Officer, I'm a Gotham City DA with information relevant to this situation," she said firmly. "Let me pass." He did. The sky was ashen purple above the towering buildings of the asylum. Police cars lined the asphalt drive, casting everything in flashing red and blue. The usually dark facilities seemed even more eerie in the incredibly bright lights. She could see the officers wrangling up the inmates that were wandering about the grounds. She weaved through the sea of police cars until she found Sergeant Gordon. "Okay, I understand this guy letting her across the bridge because she has important information, but did no one stop to think, hey, maybe give the DA like not an honor guard." Sorry, I've been writing summaries for the rewrite of the GOT rewrite all day. But to give her like some type of guard or something so she doesn't get hurt. I know there were police officers over there, but it just seems incredibly dangerous. But moving on. "Flask, cool it," he yelled at one of the other officers who was pointing his gun at one of the inmates. "Gordon!" He turned around and his eyes widened in surprise. "What are you doing back here?" "Our mutual friend sent me with these." She pulled the syringe and the 2 vials from her jacket and handed them to him. "Hopefully you won't need them." "Not unless he's got some way of getting that stuff into the air." He looked uneasily at the chaos around him. Thank you. Look, you need to get off the island before they raise the bridge." "Is there anything I can do?" He shook his head. "Feels like Flask called on the whole police force for this one. Most of the inmates were just wandering around the island." "Most?" We haven't found any of the maximum security prisoners yet." Her eyes widened. Apparently he had said too much. "We have it under control. Thank you." She nodded and turned back towards the sea of cars. She was halfway down the drive. She'd barely been able to get off the bridge with her car when she noticed a girl, no more than maybe 12 or 13, trying to get the attention of a large man standing beside a SWAT van. Head! God, that was a long sentence. My God. Anyway. "Hey, can you help me find my mom?" she said, tapping his arm. "Excuse me." He shoved her aside offhandedly, knocking the glasses right off her face. Rachel hurried over and picked up the girl stick frames off the ground. "I'll help you find her," she said, handing them back to her. She turned to the SWAT member then. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" He responded by pulling a pistol on her. She narrowed her eyes, but he lost interest when the doors of the van opened behind him. "Gentlemen?" Jonathan Crane stepped down from the van, standing next to a large machine on the ground. "It's time to spread the word." He leaned down and flipped the switch on the machine's top. It split apart, and a fast whirring noise began inside. "And the word is fear." And that is the end of that chapter. And this is I think like the shortest Rachel. Oh, that's not true. Her first chapter was pretty short. This isn't bad. It's not bad. There are a few things in here that I don't think make a lot of sense. Like, I had some issues keeping up with whether Rachel had her car in the beginning, but that's like minor. Again, Rachel being sent over there basically by herself. I know police officers are everywhere, but it just seems kind of like dangerous. And then here, Rachel has a gun pointed at her head and she just narrows her eyes at the guy who is holding the gun. Like what? That's nuts to me. Also, I'm pretty sure in the actual movie, the guy doesn't point a gun at Rachel. He just points at her. I don't know why. It's also been a long time since I've watched Batman Begins, but I don't remember a gun. So that kind of makes a little bit more sense, but anyway, let's move on. So our last chapter for this episode is a Gordon chapter. The whole place seemed to explode. Steam erupted from the ground, throwing manhole covers into the air. Clouds of vapor billowed out of every open space on the island, covering it in a dense white fog. Gordon started to feel a panic rising inside him. All of the people turned to black shapes, silhouettes in the white clouds. He groped at his jacket for the syringe and jabbed it into his thigh just as his breath started to quicken. Rachel didn't describe what the stuff in the syringes was, and I guess the implication was there after what happened earlier, but it's weird that she never says, like, one of these is for mass production and one's for you. Like, I don't know. Moving on. Flask wasn't so lucky. He was staggering toward an inmate with his gun drawn. "Get down!" Gordon could hear the fear in his voice. The man widened his eyes and began backing up frantically. "I said get down!" Flask roared. Oh God. There are so many times where I read lines and then my brain doesn't register the dialogue tag after it, so it sounds really awkward. Sorry about that. Gordon smashed his elbow into the side of his head and he fell to the ground, unconscious. You know what? Not to stop immediately after making a comment, but has anyone else noticed that throughout this, every time someone gets hit and goes unconscious, they fell to the ground, unconscious? Every single time. It's always written the same way. And like low-key, high-key, it drives me fucking nuts. It's just one of those things that like I did in every single story, so it comes up a lot. It's like those early writing patterns, I guess, and I don't know. I just don't know why I always did it like that. At that moment, Jim's radio came to life. "This is Commissioner Loeb. Somebody talk to me." "This is Gordon," he said back once he pulled it from his hip. "What the hell is going on in there?" "We need reinforcements," he started. "TAC team, SWAT, riot police, get them in mass and... Gordon, we had another situation in the Narrows. Half the city's riot police are there and the other half is already with you. Well, they're incapacitated. There's nobody left to send in." His eyes widened. "So I'm on my own?" If Loeb responded, he couldn't hear it because something came crashing down to the ground behind him. When he looked up, there was a blindingly bright light behind him. It stretched his shadow out to wild proportions. He whipped around to find the tumbler staring back at him and the Batman climbing out from under its sliding plates. "The asylum is tearing itself apart," Jim said to him in an exasperated tone. "This is just the beginning. If they hit the mains, there's nothing to stop the whole city from tearing itself apart. How are they going to do that? They're not. I'm not letting them get off the island with that machine." And that is the end of that chapter. Again, Gordon's chapters are all like too short, except for his very last chapter isn't. Discounting the epilogue, which is also told from his POV. But I mean, it did what it needed to do, I guess. It's just really weird to see this sandwich. Like, Rachel's last chapter wasn't super long, but it wasn't super short either, and it was nothing special. Like, it was fine. And then you get this chapter where it's like, it seems like something really like interesting is about to happen, and then it just cuts off. And then we get like a super substantive Rachel chapter after this, as we'll see next episode. And it's kind of like, Gordon, why? Why does Gordon get nothing to do? I feel like this is a symptom of the fact that this story is based on a movie, and I decided to use a close POV format. When you do that, by the way, close POV means basically like the story is in third person, but the third person narrator only focuses on one character. So like the books from the A Song of Ice and Fire series, those are written in close third person POV. Harry Potter is another example. But the issue with that is that when you come from a third person medium like film, the camera tends to look at a lot of other situations that are going on. So you have all these different scenes that are disparate from each other. When you go in and try and turn that into a fic with a close POV structure, you have to find a bunch of scenes to sort of put together so your chapters aren't terribly short. So Gordon, fortunately, doesn't have a lot of scenes that you can do that with. He just has his singular scenes that are in there. You can't like stitch it together with another scene without skipping really far through the timeline and then having to rewind back with another character's chapter. So he ends up just getting shortchanged and having these really, really short chapters. And it's unfortunate because, like, I feel like, again, he is a really compelling character, but his chapters are so short and wildly uninteresting compared to everyone else's, to be honest. But, you know, either way, the chapter did what it needed to do, but it was not long enough, you know. So, yeah, that is the end of the episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like this video, don't forget to like and favorite. Ooh, I always say that and then I'm like, wait, isn't that the same thing? Don't forget to like the video on the YouTubes and then subscribe. Watch other videos, that helps. And I will see you for the next one, which I think will be the last episode of Batman Begins. It better be. God. So I'll see you then. Bye.